Hi guys, Miss Francis here. Today we're going to talk about why carbon compounds are the key to the variety of life. On your iPads, I would suggest that you download the Macromolecule app. If you go to the App Store and just search Macromolecule, the app will pull up, and I will refer to it throughout this unit. This is a really nice video by Frank Gregorio that introduces us to all the different chemicals and why they're so important for our life. So last unit we learned that water makes up about 70 to 95% of our cells, but what's the rest of it? Well, the rest of it is mostly carbon-based compounds, those compounds being carbs, carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. And besides for carbon, the other elements that make up those compounds include hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, sulfur, and phosphorus. So organic chemistry is the study of carbon compounds, and what does it mean for a compound to be organic? That means that compound has got carbon and hydrogen. So for example, methane, which is CH4, has carbon and hydrogen. It is considered an organic compound. Vitalism is this theory that living organisms were composed of organic chemicals that could only be produced in living organisms because this vital force that was only found in living organisms was needed. So people thought that these organic chemicals couldn't be made in a lab setting, that they couldn't be made artificially, but that you had to extract them from living animals. So how can you test this theory? Well, you could see if you could create a organic chemical in an artificial setting, and that's what ended up happening. Urea is a nitrogenous waste. It's found in urine, and Frederick Wohler accidentally created urea in his lab. So that therefore disproved this idea, this theory of vitalism. Carbon atoms are the most versatile building blocks of molecules. With an atomic number of 6, carbon has 6 protons and 6 electrons. The first two electrons will be found in the first shell, the one closest to the nucleus, where the remaining 4 electrons will be found in carbon's valence shell, its outer shell. Therefore, carbon can make 4 covalent bonds by sharing electrons with other atoms. In this video, Stephanie Castle goes into greater detail about carbon bonding. So look at these molecules. We just said that carbon can form 4 covalent bonds with atoms around it. So let's count. In methane, you've got 1, 2, 3, 4 bonds with other atoms. What about here? This is ethane. Let's count how many bonds each carbon forms. So you've got 1, 2, 3, 4 bonds around this carbon. And let's check out this carbon. 1, 2, 3, 4 bonds surrounding that carbon. And ethene, let's take a look at this. You've got 1, 2, and now here we've got a double bond, so 3, 4, and now let's check out our second carbon. 1, 2, 3, 4. So you see how carbon can form 4 bonds with other atoms within each compound. Hydrocarbons are organic molecules that consist of only carbon and hydrogen. Butane and isobutane are classic examples. Fats are biological molecules that have long hydrocarbon tails. So here's the hydrocarbon tail, and it's going to be attached to a non-hydrocarbon component. Because it's attached to a non-hydrocarbon component, it's going to give fats its characteristic properties, which we will get into when we talk about fats. So if we look at these two molecules, butane and isobutane, let's talk about their similarities, their differences, and how we can uncover their their formula. So all we need to do is count how many carbons and how many hydrogens to determine its formula. Well, I count 4 carbons and 10 hydrogens. In isobutane, I also count 4 carbons and 10 hydrogens. So they have the same molecular formula. That's a similarity. However, even though they're both branching, can you see how this is a skeletal branching pattern? And this is just like a broken branched pattern. So we talked about fats, and we talked about how they're similar and how they're different, right? Butane has that straight skeleton and isobutane has a branched skeleton. So these two compounds, butane and isobutane, are called isomers. Isomers are compounds that have the same molecular formula but different structures, and because they have different structures, they're going to have different chemical properties, which is going to give them different functions. So here, just repeating that, isomers are compounds that have the same molecular formula, but different structure and therefore different chemical properties. As a classic example, you've got butane and isobutane. So let's do a little review. What are the 6 major elements that make up living matter? Carbon, oxygen, hydrogen, and nitrogen. Smaller amounts of sulfur and phosphorus. What kind of bonds join these elements? Covalent bonds. And how many covalent bonds does carbon form? It's going to form 4. So now let's talk about macromolecules and what a macromolecule is. A macromolecule is a large molecule. When we join thousands of smaller organic molecules, that's when we get a macromolecule. And there are 4 major classes of macromolecules, and we discussed these in the very beginning. They're carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acid. This video shows relative size, starting with human skin and getting smaller, but started at minute 6 and 15 seconds. So most macromolecules are polymers. Well, what's a polymer? A polymer is a chain-like molecule made up of monomers, meaning that a polymer consists of many similar or identical building blocks linked by covalent bonds. And those building blocks, those small molecules, are called monomers. So each one of our macromolecules is going to have its own monomer. Oh, Jesus. How are we going to form these macromolecules? Through a process known as condensation or dehydration synthesis. What that means is that smaller molecules are joined by the removal of water to produce larger molecules. This process requires energy. It will be aided by enzymes. Enzymes are catalysts that are going to speed up any chemical reaction. In this case, the chemical reaction is dehydration synthesis. This reaction is also considered anabolic. It's considered anabolic because we're synthesizing, we're making complex molecules from simpler molecules. And how can you remember that? That bodybuilders take anabolic steroids to build their muscles. Now, this reaction that joins the monomers to form polymers involves hydroxyl groups. Hydroxyl groups consist of an oxygen and a hydrogen. Looks like OH, and the bond between the O and the H is a polar covalent bond. So for example, here's our hydroxyl group bonded to our carbon skeleton, and within our hydroxyl group you will find a polar covalent bond. Alcohols contain a hydroxyl group. Now, why is it important that the hydroxyl groups contain a polar covalent bond? Well, what it does is it helps improve the solubility of the organic molecules that contain the hydroxyl group. Compounds that have hydroxyl groups are alcohols, and their names typically end in OL, for example, glycerol and ethanol. Now let's say so I made this slide because I wanted to show you guys how you could take notes where you're not writing down every single word, right? So we know that condensation is also known as dehydration synthesis. Sometimes it's called the condensation reaction. It involves the hydroxyl group, which is a OH that's connected by a polar covalent bond. Because it's polar, that's going to make, it's going to dissolve in water, therefore improving the solubility of the organic molecules that contain the hydroxyl group. Now let's say we want to break apart our polymers into monomers maybe, or just into smaller molecules. So hydrolysis reactions break apart large molecules into small ones by adding water. Hydrolysis is common in digestive processes, and this is known as a catabolic reaction because we're breaking down complex molecules into simpler molecules. So what reaction does the diagram to the right represent? Hydrolysis, because we are adding water and we're going from molecule A large polymer, down to molecule C and molecule D. So which represents a monomer, a singular molecule? Molecule D, which represents polymers, A and C, because they're multiple molecules, or multiple, I guess you could say molecules together in a compound. What is the source of the H and the OH on the molecules of C and D? Well, that would be water, which is molecule B. And what is the opposite reaction to this? Well, the opposite reaction to this would be dehydration synthesis, or condensation, the building up of a polymer.